On D-Day, the MG-42 gunners were not just defenders, they were the most hunted men on the battlefield. From concrete bunkers above Omaha Beach, they cut down the first American waves with brutal efficiency, turning open sand and shallow water into a killing ground. But every second they fired also sealed their fate. The Allies knew that the invasion could not move forward until those guns were silenced. What followed was not a distant firefight. It was a methodical, ruthless push toward the bunkers. Infantry crawled under fire. Engineers blew their way forward. Rangers climbed the bluffs to attack from behind. When the Allies finally reached the MG-42 positions, the fight ended in grenades, flamethrowers, close-range gunfire, and desperate surrenders. This is the story of what the Allies did to MG-42 gunners on D-Day, and what awaited the men who pulled the trigger long before the first landing craft appeared off the coast of Normandy. The MG-42 crews were already awake. In the early hours of June 6, 1944, the sky over the channel was dark and heavy, with low clouds pressing down on the sea. Inside concrete bunkers cut into the bluffs above Omaha Beach, German soldiers moved quietly through familiar routines. Belts of ammunition were checked one last time. Spare barrels were laid out within arm's reach. Water cans, rifles, grenades, and gas masks were pushed against the walls where they would not get in the way. Each man knew his position and his task, because they had rehearsed this moment again and again. These bunkers were part of what the Germans called resistance nests. They were not placed at random. Every firing slit, every angle, and every field of fire had been carefully measured. Machine guns were positioned not to shoot straight out at the sea, but to fire sideways along the beach. This meant that any soldier who landed and tried to move forward would be exposed the entire time. If he escaped one gun, he would likely walk into the fire of another. On Omaha Beach alone, more than a dozen of these strong points covered the sand in overlapping arcs of fire. Inside each nest, the MG-42 crew worked as a small team. The gunner lay or knelt behind the weapon, eyes fixed on the narrow view outside the firing slit. Beside him, the assistant gunner fed ammunition belts into the gun and watched for signs of overheating. A third man stayed close, ready to carry fresh belts forward and remove empty ones. In theory, this teamwork allowed the MG-42 to fire almost without pause. In practice, it also meant that if one man fell, the others had to take his place immediately. Some of these crews were veterans. They had fought in France, in Russia, or in North Africa. They knew what artillery sounded like and what infantry assaults looked like. Others were much younger. By 1944, losses on the Eastern Front had forced the German army to fill coastal defenses with replacements who had little combat experience. These younger soldiers knew the weapon well, but they had never seen an enemy try to kill them. As they waited in the darkness, fear sat quietly beside discipline. German commanders believed that stopping the invasion meant stopping it early. If the attackers could be destroyed on the beaches, there would be no need to fight inland. This idea shaped everything about the defenses. The bunkers were strong, built from thick reinforced concrete, designed to survive heavy shelling. The MG-42 was chosen because of its speed and reliability. Its rate of fire was terrifying, but just as important, it was simple to maintain under pressure. As long as ammunition held out and barrels could be changed, the gun would keep working. Shortly before dawn, the stillness broke. Far out at sea, faint flashes lit the horizon. The sound followed seconds later, deep and rolling. Allied naval guns had opened fire. Battleships, cruisers, and destroyers poured shells toward the coast, aiming at known German positions. The ground shook as explosions walked across the bluffs. Inside the bunkers, dust fell from the ceilings and lights flickered. Men pressed themselves against the walls and waited. Some bunkers took direct hits. Others were rocked again and again by near misses. But many survived. The concrete held. Firing slits were damaged, but not destroyed. When the shelling lifted, the MG-42 crews emerged from the smoke shaken but alive. They knew from training that this bombardment meant only one thing: the invasion was about to begin. As the light grew stronger, the sea came into view. What the gunners saw was almost impossible to understand at first. The water was filled with ships. Landing craft stretched across the horizon, moving steadily toward the shore. Some German soldiers later said it felt unreal, like a picture from a book rather than something happening in front of them. For a moment, there was silence again, broken only by the sound of engines and waves. Orders were clear. The MG-42 crews were to hold fire until the enemy came into effective range. Ammunition was precious. Firing too early would only reveal positions and waist belts. The men waited, fingers tense on triggers, eyes straining through smoke and haze. Each second felt longer than the last. When the first landing craft reached the shallows, the waiting ended. Ramps dropped. Men spilled forward into water that was deeper than expected. Some stumbled and fell under the weight of their gear. Others tried to run, only to slow to a walk in the surf. That was when the MG-42S opened up. The sound was immediate and overwhelming. The weapon did not fire in slow bursts like older machine guns. It tore through ammunition in a blur, sending long streams of bullets across the sand and water. From the bunkers, gunners swept their fire back and forth, aiming low to catch legs and bodies at the waterline. Men fell, and those behind them tripped over the wounded and dead. Inside the bunkers, the crews worked without speaking. The assistant gunner fed belt after belt into the weapon. When the barrel began to glow, it was swapped out in seconds. Empty belts piled up on the floor. Spent casings rattled against the walls. The smell of hot metal and gunpowder filled the air. At this stage, the MG-42 crews still believed they could stop the assault. The beach below them was a killing zone, just as planned. Tanks that were supposed to support the attackers were nowhere to be seen. Smoke and confusion hid any signs of coordination. From the German point of view, the defense was working. What they did not yet realize was that every burst of fire was drawing attention. Allied planners had studied these defenses for months. Many resistance nests were marked on maps and given numbers. Naval observers and forward troops were already identifying which guns were still active. While the MG-42S dominated the beach, they also marked themselves as the most dangerous targets on the battlefield. As the first waves were cut down, the next ones kept coming. The water continued to fill with men and equipment. For the MG-42 crews, there was no pause, no relief. They fired and fired again, knowing that as long as they held their positions, the invasion could still be broken. But with each passing minute, the beach grew more crowded, and the odds slowly began to change. By the time the sun was fully above the horizon, the MG-42S had done terrible damage. Yet the beach was not empty. Scattered groups of American soldiers were still alive, pinned down but not defeated. And somewhere, below the bluffs, those survivors were already beginning to look up, searching for the guns that were killing them. By mid-morning, on June 6, 1944, Omaha Beach had turned into a place of confusion and shock. Smoke hung low over the sand, mixing with mist from the sea and dust from shattered obstacles. The tide carried bodies and equipment back and forth, while bullets continued to tear across the open ground. The MG-42s above the beach were still firing, and as long as they remained active, every movement below felt exposed and dangerous. For the American soldiers who survived the first minutes, time seemed distorted. Seconds stretched into minutes, and minutes passed without any sense of progress. Training had taught them to move forward, but the ground offered almost no protection. The shingle at the back of the beach provided some cover, but reaching it meant crossing open sand under machine gun fire. Many men froze where they landed, pressed flat against the ground, hoping the gun would somehow miss them. The MG-42 crews could see this hesitation. From their elevated positions, they watched figures struggle in the surf, crawl forward, or lie still. Gunners adjusted their aim and continued sweeping fire across the beach. They aimed low, knowing that a man hit in the legs would fall and block others behind him. Wounded soldiers drew medics and friends, creating clusters of movement that were easy to target. It was not personal. It was technique, drilled into them during training. Yet even for the gunners, the situation was not simple. The volume of fire was exhausting. Barrels overheated quickly and had to be changed again and again. Ammunition belts ran fast. In some bunkers, assistant gunners were killed or wounded by shell fragments or small arms fire coming from the beach. When that happened, the gunner had to work alone, feeding the weapon, changing barrels, and watching the field of fire all at once. The naval bombardment had failed to destroy most of the machine gun positions, but it had damaged the battlefield in other ways. Craters and wreckage broke up the beach, creating small pockets of cover. American soldiers began to use these features instinctively. They crawled from hole to hole, dragging wounded men with them. Officers and non-commissioned officers tried to regroup scattered units, often taking command of men they had never met before. One of the biggest problems for the attackers was the lack of armored support. The plan had called for amphibious tanks to land early and provide fire against the bunkers. In reality, heavy seas had swamped most of them. Those that reached the shore were quickly knocked out or forced to withdraw. Without tanks, the task of silencing the MG-42s fell almost entirely on infantry, engineers, and small support teams. Slowly, patterns began to form. Soldiers learned to watch the MG-42s for brief pauses when barrels were changed or belts ran out. These pauses were short, but they were enough for a few men to sprint forward or dive into better cover. Every meter gained mattered. Progress was measured not in yards, but in bodies moved closer to the bluffs. The MG-42 crews started to notice changes as well. The beach was no longer just a mass of helpless targets. Smoke screens appeared, thrown by naval gunfire or hand grenades. Isolated groups of Americans were no longer staying still. They were moving sideways, probing for weak points. Rifle fire and light machine gun rounds began snapping toward bunker openings. Even if these shots did little damage, they forced the gunners to stay low between bursts. In several sectors, engineers began clearing obstacles under fire. These men carried explosives and tools, and their job was to open paths through beach defenses. Many were killed doing this work, but some succeeded. Each cleared lane made it easier for more troops to reach the base of the bluffs. From the German point of view, this was dangerous. The MG-42 was most effective at range. Once attackers reached the foot of the hill, the angles of fire became limited. As the morning wore on, ammunition became a growing concern inside the bunkers. Supply routes were supposed to bring fresh belts from rear positions, but many of these routes were under shell fire or already cut off. Runners sent to fetch more ammunition sometimes did not return. In some strong points, crews began counting belts, knowing that once they ran out, their situation would change completely. The psychological strain was intense. The MG-42 gunners had expected a hard fight, but not the scale of what they were seeing. The number of attackers seemed endless. No matter how many fell, more kept coming. The sound of the gun never stopped echoing in their ears. The heat inside the bunkers rose, and the air grew thick with smoke and dust. For younger soldiers, this was their first experience of combat, and it was overwhelming. Below, American soldiers were reaching a breaking point of their own. Casualties were severe, and leadership losses were high. Units that landed together were often shattered within minutes. Yet this chaos also forced adaptation. Without clear orders, small groups began acting on their own judgment. A handful of men with a light machine gun or a bazooka could make a difference if they reached the right position. In one area, a small team crawled toward a strong point that was sweeping the beach from the side. They waited for a pause in the machine gun fire, then rushed forward, dragging their weapon through the sand. They targeted a supporting gun first, reducing the fire coming from the position. This kind of action was repeated in different forms across Omaha. Each success was small, but together they began to reduce the pressure. For the MG-42 crews, this was the moment when confidence began to crack. The weapon was still deadly, but the situation was no longer under their control. They could feel the attackers getting closer, hear bullets striking the concrete around the firing slits, and sense movement where there had once been only open ground. The idea of stopping the invasion at the water's edge was slipping away. By late morning, the beach was still dangerous, but it was no longer impossible. Scattered groups of Americans had reached the shingle and the base of the bluffs. From there, they prepared to climb, flank, and attack the bunkers from angles the MG-42 crews could not easily cover. The guns were still firing, but now they were being hunted. By late morning on June 6, 1944, the balance on Omaha Beach had begun to shift. The MG-42s still dominated open ground, but the battle was no longer frozen at the shoreline. American soldiers were no longer waiting for orders that might never come. Small groups were forming on their own, drawn together by proximity rather than unit markings. What mattered now was not who you belonged to, but who was willing to move. For these men, the MG-42s were no longer just a threat. They were objectives. Every active machine gun marked a place that had to be reached and destroyed, no matter the cost. Officers, sergeants, engineers, and rangers understood that as long as those guns were firing, nothing else could move forward. The machine gun nests became the center of attention for anyone trying to survive on the beach. Movement was slow and exhausting. Men crawled through wet sand and loose shingle, their bodies pressed flat to avoid drawing attention. They used shell craters, damaged obstacles, and piles of debris as temporary cover. Even the dead provided some shelter. Every time a gun paused, someone moved. When it resumed, everyone froze. The MG-42 crews could sense this change. Through their firing slits, they no longer saw large groups charging blindly forward. Instead, they saw brief flashes of movement, then nothing. Bullets struck the concrete around them more often now. Rifle fire snapped close enough to make them pull back from the openings between bursts. In some positions, snipers began targeting assistant gunners, knowing that removing one man could slow the entire weapon. Inside the bunkers, pressure mounted. The heat was intense, made worse by constant firing. Barrels had to be changed more often. Hands burned on hot metal. In some nests, water supplies were running low. Ammunition belts were no longer endless piles. Every burst was shorter, more controlled. Gunners were forced to pick targets rather than simply sweeping the beach. One of the greatest dangers for the MG-42 crews was the loss of communication. Telephone lines connecting the strong points were often cut by shellfire. Runners sent to nearby positions sometimes never returned. This left each bunker isolated, fighting its own battle without knowing what was happening to the others. A crew might believe neighboring guns were still firing, when in reality they had already been destroyed or abandoned. On the beach, American engineers began using explosives in a more aggressive way. Bangalore torpedoes and satchel charges were dragged forward and detonated near obstacles and bunker walls. The blasts did not always destroy the positions, but they stunned defenders and filled firing slits with dust and smoke. Even a few seconds of blindness could save lives. Bazookas also came into play. Though not designed to penetrate thick concrete, they could damage doors, embrasures, and supporting weapons near the machine guns. A hit near a firing slit could shower the interior with fragments, wounding or killing crew members. Each successful shot boosted morale for the attackers and increased anxiety inside the bunkers. For the MG-42 gunners, the sense of being hunted became unmistakable. They could hear movement above them, boots scraping on rock and earth. Grenades began landing closer, bouncing off concrete before exploding. The sound of American voices drifted down from the bluffs, carried by smoke and wind. What had once felt like a secure fortress now felt like a trap. Some crews tried to adjust their tactics. They reduced firing to avoid revealing their exact position. Others fired tracer rounds high to draw attention while a neighboring gun aimed lower. These tricks had worked earlier in the day, but now the attackers were more cautious. Experience was being earned the hardest way possible. In several strong points, assistant gunners were lost. When that happened, the gunner faced an impossible task. He had to keep watch, fire the weapon, change barrels, and feed ammunition alone. Fatigue set in quickly. Mistakes followed. A dropped belt or a delayed barrel change could mean the difference between holding the position and being overrun. Below the bluffs, small assault teams were forming with clear goals. They carried grenades, explosives, and flamethrowers. Their aim was not to trade fire with the MG-42s, but to reach them from the side or rear. This often meant climbing steep slopes under fire, using roots and rocks for handholds. Men slipped, fell, and sometimes rolled back down the hill. Others kept going. The MG-42s could not easily cover these approaches. Their firing slits were designed to dominate the beach, not the ground directly above or behind them. As attackers reached these blind spots, the advantage shifted rapidly. A bunker that had controlled hundreds of meters of shoreline could be neutralized by a few men in the right place. Inside one position, a crew heard an explosion nearby and felt the shockwave through the walls. Dust filled the air, and the gun fell silent for a moment. When it resumed firing, the rate was slower. Outside, attackers took note. They moved again, closer this time. By early afternoon, the beach exits were no longer completely sealed. In several sectors, American troops had reached the tops of the bluffs and begun attacking from inland. This was a turning point. MG-42 crews, who had spent the entire morning firing toward the sea, now faced threats from multiple directions. Some tried to reposition their weapons. Others abandoned them and grabbed rifles. The idea of holding until the invasion failed was gone. Survival became the priority. For some gunners, that meant fighting to the last round. For others, it meant waiting for a chance to run or surrender. The MG-42, once a symbol of control and power, now marked its crew as the most dangerous targets on the battlefield. As the sound of gunfire shifted inland, the fate of the remaining MG-42 crews was being decided. The attackers were close, determined, and no longer pinned down, By early afternoon on June 6, 1944, the battle for Omaha Beach had moved into its most violent phase. The long-distance killing from the bluffs was giving way to close fighting around the concrete strongpoints. American soldiers were reaching the machine gun nests that had held them pinned down for hours. For the MG-42 crews, this was the moment they had feared from the start. The design of the bunkers now worked against the men inside them. Thick concrete walls that had protected them from naval shells also limited their movement. Firing slits that once offered wide control of the beach became narrow windows with blind spots. As attackers climbed the slopes and moved along the sides of the positions, the machine guns could not easily track them. Assault teams moved with urgency. Engineers, infantrymen, and rangers gathered outside bunker entrances and ventilation shafts. They carried grenades, satchel charges, and flamethrowers. Their goal was simple: silence the gun as quickly as possible. Hesitation meant death, because even a few seconds of renewed MG-42 fire could cut down men approaching from the open. When the first grenade landed inside a bunker, the effect was immediate. The blast echoed off the concrete, filling the space with smoke and dust. Men were stunned, wounded, or killed outright. The MG-42 often fell silent at this point, either because the crew was hit or because they were forced to take cover. In those seconds, attackers rushed closer. Some bunkers were entered through rear doors or damaged sections of wall. Others were attacked through firing slits, with grenades tossed inside or flamethrowers used to pour fire into the interior. The heat and smoke were unbearable. Oxygen vanished quickly. For the men inside, there was little room to escape or hide. The fighting in these moments was short and brutal. There was no time for negotiation. American soldiers who reached the bunker knew exactly what that gun had done to their friends on the beach. Anger and fear drove them forward. Any defender who resisted was shot at close range. Those who were wounded or disoriented often had no chance to react before the fight was over. In some cases, MG-42 crews attempted to surrender. Hands went up. Weapons were dropped. Whether that surrender was accepted depended on the situation and the men involved. Some attackers took prisoners and sent them to the rear. Others, overwhelmed by losses and adrenaline, fired anyway. The line between combat and execution blurred in the smoke and noise. Flamethrowers played a grim role in these assaults. When used against bunker openings, they filled the interior with fire and thick smoke. Even if defenders were not burned, the heat and lack of air forced them out or rendered them unconscious. For those trapped inside, it was one of the most terrifying weapons they could face. For the attackers, it was an effective way to end the fight quickly. Not all bunkers fell easily. Some MG-42 crews fought until their ammunition was gone. Others tried to reposition their guns to cover entrances, firing point-blank at attackers who appeared suddenly in doorways. In these moments, survival came down to seconds and angles. A single grenade or burst of fire decided everything. Outside, the ground around the strongpoints was littered with bodies and equipment. American soldiers regrouped as each bunker was cleared, checking for wounded and preparing to move on to the next objective. Each destroyed MG-42 changed the battlefield. The sound of continuous fire faded, replaced by scattered shots and shouted orders. For the German defenders, the collapse of a bunker often meant the collapse of an entire section of the line. Once one strong point fell, neighboring positions were exposed to attack from the side or rear. This chain reaction spread along the bluffs. Crews who had not yet been assaulted could hear the fighting nearby and knew their turn was coming. Some MG-42 gunners chose to abandon their positions before the attackers arrived. They grabbed rifles and ran through trenches or shell craters, trying to escape inland. Others stayed, either out of duty, fear, or the belief that surrender would not save them. Each choice carried risk. Retreating under fire was dangerous. Staying meant facing close combat in a confined space. Inside one position, a lone gunner continued firing even after his assistants were gone. His hands were blistered from hot metal. His ammunition was nearly exhausted. When grenades began landing around him, he had no place to go. In another bunker, a wounded crew lay helpless as smoke filled the room. Moments later, the firing slit went dark. By mid-afternoon, many of the MG-42 positions that had dominated Omaha Beach were silent. Some were destroyed. Others were captured and occupied by American troops who turned the guns outward or disabled them completely. The change was immediate and dramatic. Without the constant machine gun fire, movement on the beach became possible. Armored vehicles that had survived earlier now began to push forward. Engineers opened exits through the bluffs. Reinforcements flowed inland. The German defensive plan, built around stopping the invasion at the shoreline, had failed. The MG-42s had inflicted terrible losses, but they could not stop the attackers forever. For the MG-42 crews who survived these assaults, the experience was shattering. The bunker, once a place of control, had become a cage. The weapon that gave them power had also marked them as targets. In the final moments of the fight, many realized that their fate was no longer in their own hands. By mid-afternoon on June 6, 1944, the fighting on Omaha Beach had broken into scattered pockets. The long, continuous roar of machine guns was gone, replaced by isolated bursts of rifle fire deeper inland. Many MG-42 positions had been destroyed or abandoned. For the German gunners who were still alive, the battle entered its most uncertain phase. Some crews were trapped inside damaged bunkers. Smoke hung in the air, and debris covered the floors. Ammunition was gone, or nearly gone. Wounded men lay against the walls, unable to move. Outside, the sound of American boots and voices grew closer. For these gunners, there were only two choices left: try to surrender or fight until the end. Surrender was not a simple decision. MG-42 crews knew the damage their weapon had done. They had watched men fall by the dozens on the beach below. They understood that the attackers reaching them had likely lost friends moments earlier. The fear was not just of capture, but of what might happen in the seconds after. In some cases, surrender worked. German soldiers emerged from bunkers slowly, hands raised, helmets removed. Weapons were dropped on the ground. American troops disarmed them and sent them to the rear under guard. These prisoners were shocked to still be alive. Many had expected immediate death. For them, survival felt unreal. In other cases, surrender failed. American soldiers arrived at bunkers filled with rage and exhaustion. They had spent hours under MG-42 fire, watching men die without being able to help them. When they reached the gunners responsible, control sometimes broke down. There are accounts of MG-42 crews being shot after capture or killed while trying to surrender. These incidents were not universal, but they did happen, and the men involved rarely spoke about them afterward. The rules of war still existed on paper. The Geneva Convention required prisoners to be treated humanely. Many American units followed these rules, even under extreme stress. But Omaha Beach was not a courtroom or a parade ground. It was a place where fear, anger, and adrenaline shaped decisions in seconds. In that environment, outcomes were unpredictable. Some MG-42 gunners chose not to surrender at all. They abandoned their positions and tried to escape inland. Without coordinated lines or support, these men moved alone or in small groups through hedges and shell craters. They avoided roads and open fields, knowing American patrols were spreading quickly. For some, this gamble worked. For others, it ended with capture or death. Wounded gunners faced the worst odds. Unable to run or resist, they depended entirely on the behavior of the men who found them. Some were treated and taken prisoner. Others were left behind or killed during the chaos. The speed of the advance meant that not every wounded defender received attention. As American forces secured the bluffs and pushed forward, they began consolidating the battlefield. Prisoners were gathered, searched, and marched to collection points near the beach. Many MG-42 gunners tried to hide their role. They claimed to be riflemen or support troops. In the confusion, this often worked. There was no easy way to identify who had fired which gun. The psychological strain on both sides was immense. American soldiers who survived Omaha carried the memory of the machine gun fire with them. For many, the MG-42 became a symbol of terror. German gunners carried a different burden. They remembered the faces in the surf and the endless waves of attackers. Even those who felt they had simply done their duty struggled with what they had seen and done. By late afternoon, Omaha Beach was firmly in Allied hands. Supply lines were opening. Vehicles moved through the exits. The invasion had survived its most dangerous test. For the MG-42 crews, the moment of decision had passed. Their role in the battle was over, but the consequences were only beginning. Captured gunners were moved inland and eventually sent to prisoner camps. Some would spend months or years in captivity. Others would be interrogated and then assigned to labor duties. Their war, for all practical purposes, ended on the beach or in the bluffs above it. Those who escaped faced a different future. They rejoined German units fighting in the Norman countryside. There, the MG-42 would continue to be used, but never again in such concentrated defensive positions. The chance to stop the invasion in a single day was gone. For many gunners, the memory of surrender stayed sharp. The moment when they stepped out of the bunker, unsure if they would be shot or spared, never faded. It became the dividing line between life and death in their personal histories. As the sun began to set on June 6, 1944, Omaha Beach looked nothing like it had that morning. The sand was torn apart, marked by craters, wreckage, and the remains of men and equipment. The MG-42s that had once ruled the shoreline were silent. Their crews were gone, dead, captured, or fleeing inland. What remained was the aftermath. The long process of remembering, justifying, and living with what had happened. For those who survived on both sides, the question of what was right or wrong on that beach would never have a simple answer. When the fighting moved inland on June 6, 1944, Omaha Beach slowly emptied of noise. The sound of machine gun fire faded, replaced by engines, shouted orders, and the steady movement of men and vehicles pushing forward into Normandy. For the MG-42 gunners, who survived the day, the battle did not truly end when the guns went silent. In many ways, it followed them for the rest of their lives. Captured MG-42 crews were gathered behind the beach and marched to temporary prisoner collection areas. Many were exhausted, wounded, and still shaking from shock. Some had not slept for more than a full day. They sat on the ground under guard, surrounded by other German soldiers who had survived the collapse of the defenses. In these moments, ranks and roles no longer mattered. Gunners, riflemen, and support troops all waited together, unsure of what would come next. Interrogations began quickly, but they were often brief. American intelligence officers wanted information about nearby units, minefields, and defensive lines inland. Few prisoners knew much beyond their own position. MG-42 gunners who had inflicted heavy losses rarely admitted their role. They understood that the weapon carried a reputation, and they feared retaliation even after capture. Many claimed they had been runners, helpers, or simple infantry. Most prisoners were eventually sent to camps in England or the United States. There, the war became something distant and strange. Food was regular, shelters were dry, the danger was gone, but the memories were not. Former gunners replayed the events of that morning again and again in their minds. The sound of the gun, the sight of men falling, the moment when the bunker filled with smoke, and they thought it was over. These images stayed sharp. Those MG-42 crews who escaped capture faced a different path. They regrouped with German units retreating through Normandy. The fighting there was brutal in a different way. Hedgerows, narrow roads, and constant air attacks turned every movement into a risk. The MG-42 was still used, but now in smaller actions, ambushes, and defensive withdrawals. The days of commanding an entire beach with overlapping fire were gone. As the campaign continued, many of these gunners were killed or captured later. Others survived until the end of the war in 1945. When Germany surrendered, they returned home to towns and villages that often looked unchanged on the surface. Farms were still standing. Streets were familiar. But the men who came back were not the same. For some former MG-42 gunners, silence became a way of life. They did not speak about the war, even to family members. The weapon that had once been a source of pride was now tied to guilt and loss. In post-war Germany, survival often mattered more than stories. There was work to do and families to rebuild. The past was left unspoken. Others carried their memories openly, though quietly. They spoke only to fellow veterans who understood without judgment. They remembered not only the killing, but the fear, the waiting before dawn, the moment when they realized the attackers would not stop coming, the panic when grenades landed inside the bunker. These memories did not fade with time. On the Allied side, Omaha Beach became a defining experience for those who fought there. Veterans spoke of the MG-42 with a mix of hatred and respect. It was remembered as a force of nature, something that could not be reasoned with or escaped easily. In memoirs and interviews, when soldiers described being pinned down by a machine gun, it was often the MG-42 they meant. The sound of the weapon became legendary. Survivors described it as tearing fabric or ripping metal. Long after the war, that sound could still return in dreams. Many veterans said they never truly forgot it. The MG-42 was not just a weapon, it was the sound of exposure, helplessness, and survival measured in seconds. In the decades after the war, some former enemies met again. A few German veterans reached out to Allied soldiers they had once faced. These meetings were rare and often emotional. Men who had tried to kill each other now sat together, older, quieter, and changed. They spoke about fear more than ideology, about survival more than victory. For at least one former MG-42 gunner, meeting an American veteran he had wounded brought a small sense of closure. They talked not as enemies, but as men who had shared the same terrible morning from opposite sides. There was no justification and no forgiveness spoken aloud, only recognition of what had been endured. Omaha Beach itself became a place of memory. The bunkers still stand in the bluffs, silent and empty. The firing slits that once poured death across the sand now frame calm water and tourists walking below. For those who know the history, it is impossible to stand there without imagining what happened. The story of the MG-42 gunners on D-Day is not one of heroes or monsters. It is a story of young men placed behind a powerful weapon and told to hold the line at all costs. Some followed orders until they died. Some surrendered and lived. Some carried their actions like a weight they could never set down. What happened to them after D-Day depended on chance, timing, and the men they encountered in the final moments of battle. Mercy and violence existed side by side that day. Survival did not always mean peace. In the end, the MG-42 did everything it was designed to do. It inflicted massive casualties and delayed the invasion at terrible cost. But it could not change the outcome of the war. What it left behind were memories, scars, and questions that stayed with those who faced it, whether they stood behind the gun or ran toward it across open sand. When the guns fell silent on Omaha Beach, the invasion moved forward. But for the men who lived through that morning, the battle never truly ended.